The wind of the western plains carried the scent of burnt sage and wild honey that evening. The sun was sinking low, spilling gold across the endless field where a lone woman stood beside the fence of her late husband's farm. Her black dress fluttered around her ankles, and her hands, pale and trembling, still bore the dirt from a grave she had filled not long ago. They called her the widow, nothing more. Folks in town whispered about her, saying sorrow had taken her mind, saying no woman should linger in a house where death had walked. But she stayed, silent and hollow, as if waiting for something she could not name. It had been months since she'd spoken to another soul for more than a few words. The church bells still tolled on Sundays, but she hadn't stepped through its doors since the funeral. Nights were her hardest hours, when the wind scratched the windows and the coyotes sang in the distance. She would lie awake, her hands pressed against her stomach, aching with the emptiness that no prayer could fill. The land was dry, the corn wilted, and the promise of life seemed to mock her at every sunrise. Then, one night, the silence was broken. A horse came out of the darkness, hooves muffled against the dust. The rider dismounted without sound, his tall frame half hidden by the moonlight. He was not a white man. She could tell by the copper glint of his skin and the feathers braided into his hair. The torchlight from her porch caught his eyes. They were deep and calm, yet fierce with something ancient, something untamed. She should have run, but she didn't. The Apache warrior stood a few paces away, his shadow long across the earth. He looked at her land, the dry well, the empty barn. Then his gaze fell on her, and she felt a strange calm, as if the wind itself had stilled to listen. He spoke her name softly, like he'd known it before she was born. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, his voice low and steady. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "It's my home," she answered. "There's no one left to take it from me." He studied her face, his expression unreadable. "A home without life is a grave," he said. She turned away, the words cutting deeper than he knew. "Then let it be a grave," she whispered. "It already buried me once." He didn't leave. For several nights, she saw his campfire burning on the ridge above her field. Sometimes she caught glimpses of him walking near the edge of the woods, watching over the property. Neighbors would have called it madness, but she felt no fear. The land had grown so quiet she'd begun to think even the sky had forgotten her. His presence, strange and wild, was the first sign that the world still breathed. One evening, a storm rolled over the plains. Thunder cracked and rain fell heavy, flooding the field. She ran outside to cover the few tools she had left, her dress clinging to her in the downpour. That's when she saw him again, riding fast through the rain, leading her frightened horse back toward the barn. Together they wrestled the gates shut and took shelter under the roof. The thunder roared, lightning flashing across their faces. For a moment, neither spoke. "You came back," she said, her voice shaking. "I never left," he answered simply. "The land doesn't forget its wounded." She looked into his eyes then, and something inside her stirred something that had slept since her husband's last breath. He was nothing like the man she had lost, yet the warmth she felt near him was like standing close to fire after a long winter. They worked through the night, keeping the animals safe. When the storm finally passed, dawn painted the world clean and new. He stayed for breakfast, sitting quietly while she brewed coffee over the stove. The morning light touched his features sharp, strong, marked by years of wind and battle. He told her his people once hunted across those plains, before fences cut the horizon and soldiers filled the rivers with smoke. His village had moved south, he said, but he returned to walk the old lands, to honor the bones buried beneath. She listened, her heart heavy with the ache of what time had stolen from them both. "You don't belong here anymore," she told him softly. He looked up. "Neither do you." The truth in his words stung, because she knew he was right. The house she clung to was only a shell. Her husband was gone, her family far away, and the land that once promised a future now only mirrored her sorrow. But she couldn't leave it, was all she had left of the life she'd lost. Days passed, and his visits became more frequent. He helped mend the fences, brought water from the creek, and showed her how to find the herbs that healed the soil. He spoke little, but every word carried meaning. She found herself waiting for the sound of his footsteps at dusk. When he smiled, it was rare and fleeting, but it made her heart twist with something close to hope. Then came the night of the harvest moon. The sky was painted gold, and the air carried the scent of pine and rain. She stood by the fire, her hair loose, her heart pounding with questions she'd buried for too long. He was near, his presence filling the small space like a storm about to break. She looked at him not as a stranger, but as the only living soul who had looked at her and seen more than grief. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "If I stay," she whispered, "will you give me a child?" The question hung in the air, fragile and raw. For a heartbeat, the world went still. The Apache met her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, a promise older than the land itself. He stepped closer, his voice steady but gentle. "We'll have 5, he said. The words hit her like a spark in dry grass. She turned away breathless, unsure whether to laugh or weep. 5. She had prayed for just one, had begged heaven to fill her arms once. And now here stood a man whose world had been taken, offering her the one thing life had denied. But the moment was not made of dreams. The wind outside howled, and the scent of smoke drifted from the north. The smell of soldiers, of gunpowder, of men who still hunted the Apache. Danger was close, though neither spoke of it. The world beyond their fragile peace was cruel and watchful. He reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. "The land will rise again," he murmured. "And so will you." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't understand. The war between their worlds had never ended. It only changed its shape. Yet in that quiet cabin, beneath the weight of the storm and the smell of ash, 2 souls scarred by loss found a reason to breathe again. Outside, the wind carried the cry of an eagle, circling the field as if blessing what it had witnessed. She looked toward the horizon, where the line between dawn and night blurred like the border between love and sin. Somewhere out there, fate was riding fast toward them, and neither could stop it. The widow's heart pounded with a mix of fear and longing. She didn't know if she would stay or if he would survive what came next, but deep inside, a seed of life had already been planted. As the firelight danced between them, she felt, for the first time in years, that something new was beginning. The days that followed were heavy with silence. The widow and the Apache moved like 2 souls suspended between worlds, hers, of fences and faded hymns, his of open skies and ancestral echoes. The morning after his promise, she rose early, as she always did, but something inside her had changed. The air seemed thicker, charged with meaning. Even the sound of the wind against the fields felt alive. Yet for every heartbeat of calm, there was unease waiting beneath. He stayed near, though never in her way. Sometimes she'd catch him at the edge of the creek, his bare hands cupping the water like it was sacred. Other times he'd be repairing the roof or carving small symbols into the wooden posts by her porch. When she asked about them, he said they were for protection. Against what? She had asked. He looked toward the horizon, where the mountains bled into clouds. Against what comes, he replied. At night, the land held a strange stillness. Coyotes no longer sang. The stars seemed closer, burning low and heavy. She often found herself awake, listening for the sound of his breath outside the window. The distance between them had grown thin, yet she didn't dare cross it. Part of her still clung to the past, the church bells, the white fence, the memory of vows whispered beside her husband's grave. But another part, the one that still dreamed, was drawn to the wild heartbeat that lived inside the Apache silence. As days turned to weeks, word began to spread. A widow living alone was strange enough, but a widow keeping company with an Apache stirred gossip like a dry fire. The preacher's wife came by with bread and questions. "We've seen someone near your land," she said, her eyes sharp beneath the softness of her voice. "You should be careful. Those people don't belong here." The widow smiled faintly. "Neither do I," she answered, closing the door. But danger wasn't only in words. Frontier had its own kind of lawmen who carried rifles instead of scripture. One afternoon, 3 riders appeared at the edge of her property, dust rising behind them. She recognized one, the sheriff's brother, known for hunting more than deer. He called out her name, his tone half mocking, half curious. "Heard you've got company," he said. "The kind that don't pay taxes." She stood her ground, her fingers tight around the edge of her shawl. "You've heard wrong," she said. He spat into the dirt. "Maybe, but if I see his kind again, I'll take it as trespass." His words lingered long after he rode away. That night, the Apache came to her door. His face was calm, but his eyes burned. "They will come again," he he said. She nodded. I know. He stepped closer. Do you trust me? She didn't answer right away. The world she had known was built on rules, laws of men, of the church, of God. But none of those laws had saved her from loss. None had given her the warmth she now felt standing near him. I do, she whispered. He stayed inside that night, sitting by the fire while she mended a torn sleeve. He told her stories of his people, of how the earth once spoke to them through the wind, how rivers carried songs, and how every birth was a promise to the land. She listened, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames. We were told the land belonged to us, she said softly. But it feels like we've only borrowed it. He looked at her then, his voice steady. You can't own what you don't understand. In the following days, the weather turned colder, crops wilted further, and the nights came sooner. He helped her gather firewood, and she noticed how he touched everything with caress, if each branch, each stone, had its own spirit. Once, she asked him what he thought of death. He smiled faintly. Death is not the end, he said. It's the beginning of remembering. Those words followed her like a shadow. Each evening, when the sky turned copper and the wind whispered across the fields, she felt as if something or someone was listening. She began to dream again. In her dreams, the land was green, her house filled with laughter, and children's voices echoed through the hall. But when she awoke, there was only the sound of the fire and his quiet breathing outside. One morning, while fetching water, she found a small pouch hanging from the well. Inside were feathers, bones, and a bit of painted stone. When she showed it to him, his face darkened. You must not touch it again, he said. It's a mark. From who? She asked. Soldiers, or worse, he replied. I think I'm hiding here. Her heart thudded. Then go, she said, before they come. He shook his head. What? If I go, they'll come for you. There was no arguing with that. The world outside their small corner was closing in, yet something inside her, something fierce and forgotten, refused to bow to fear. Then we'll stay, she said. That night, he built a circle of stones near the house and lit a fire that burned low and blue. He whispered words she couldn't understand and cast the ashes into the wind. When she asked what he had done, he said, I've asked the spirits to guard what still breathes. For the first time in years, she prayed not to the God she had known, but to whatever listened beyond the stars. The moon rose full, painting the land silver. The wind carried the faint echo of drums, though none could be seen. The world felt alive, trembling with the weight of things unseen. As dawn crept in, she stood at the door watching him. His face was calm, but his body bore the marks of old battle scars that told stories no man dared repeat. You've fought for so long, she said quietly. Don't you ever tire of it? He smiled without looking at her. The land doesn't rest. Neither do I. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where smoke rose faintly from the distant ridge. It wasn't from his fire. The soldiers were near. She felt it in her bones, the same chill that had filled her heart the day her husband never came back from the river. The war she thought she had escaped was finding her again. As the sun rose higher, she began packing what little she owned, but he stopped her. You can't run from what's already here, he said. We must stand. Her voice broke. Stand against who? He looked at her, his eyes like dark rivers. Against everyone who believes this land belongs to them alone. The sound of distant hooves echoed through the valley. The widow's breath caught in her throat. He took her hand, his touch steady, grounding. Do not fear, he whispered. You asked for life. It always comes with a fight. She wanted to believe him. Yet as the wind picked up, carrying dust and the distant cry of men, she knew the peace they had built was slipping away. He released her hand and stepped outside, the light catching the edge of his blade. From the doorway, she watched him walk toward the field, the tall grass swaying like waves around him. The same field where he had first appeared, the same ground that had buried her grief, now stood between love and ruin. She wanted to call out to beg him to stay, but her voice failed. The horizon burned brighter, not with sunrise, but with fire. Somewhere beyond the ridge, rifles gleamed. She sank to her knees, her heart pounding with dread and longing. The words he had spoken echoed through her mind. The land will rise again. And as the smoke thickened and the air filled with the sound of oncoming war, she finally understood. The story between them was not about love alone. It was about defiance, about a barren heart daring to believe in life again, even as the world turned to ash around it. The earth trembled. In that trembling, she felt both fear and destiny. She rose slowly, clutching the doorframe, her eyes fixed on the figure of the Apache standing alone in the golden field. He did not look back. The wind shifted, carrying a whisper that might have been his voice, or might have been the land itself. Either way, it was a promise one not yet fulfilled. And with that, the widow stepped out into the morning light, her heart torn between two worlds that could never truly meet. The smoke on the northern ridge thinned by noon, but the quiet that followed was not peace. It was the heavy hush that comes when men hold their breath before a shot. The widow kept her hands busy, stacking wood that did not need stacking, counting sacks of flour that would not last the winter. The Apache moved across the yard with measured steps, reading the ground the way a preacher reads a psalm. He paused at the well and bent low, rubbing dirt between his fingers. 3 riders, he said. 1 with a lame horse. They watched from the cottonwoods and backed away. She tried to swallow fear and found it had already climbed into her throat. He told her he would circle the ridge before dark. She wanted to beg him to stay, but she knew a man cannot guard what he has not first understood. He left on foot, melting into the tall grass like a shadow returned to its owner. The hours after he vanished stretched thin and bright. She baked bread, more for the comfort of the task than the food, and left a slice wrapped in cloth on the porch rail for the spirits he said were listening. She had laughed when he first told her such things, but the land had opened her. She was not laughing now. Across the valley, in a clapboard house with white curtains and a stiff flag nailed to the porch, the preacher's wife spread a tablecloth and set out 2 cups. The preacher himself waited with a look that was equal parts duty and unease. Opposite him sat the sheriff's brother, spurs still dusty, eyes narrow with satisfaction that came easy to men who never apologized. "You did right to tell me," he said. "A woman like her can fall into sin without even knowing she's fell." The preacher frowned. "We are to judge with mercy." The man smiled without warmth. "Mercy is what I give when folks obey the law." He told them the troop from the fort had wandered this way last month and promised to return if the town pointed out any trouble. He folded his hands as if in prayer while he spoke about fences and grain and the safety of the children. The preacher's wife tried to see the barren widow as a threat and could not. She stirred sugar into the coffee and stared at the spoon. "She lost her husband," she said softly, "and she has no children to comfort her." The man's eyes flashed. Then she should keep to herself and not invite heathen company to her yard. He pushed back his chair and left without thanks. The preacher watched dust lift under the man's boots and wondered when righteousness had come too. "Looks so much like hunger, the Apache found thee," riders' prints by the creek where the mud still held the shape of their heels. He followed the trail until it broke over a hill and met a pair of tracks that ran heavier and straighter. Soldiers. The kind who did not bother to hide. He crouched and touched the ground, whispering names only he knew. The soil answered with the language of weight and direction. The men had swung south, toward town, where envy had sharper teeth than wolves. He stood and felt the sky press low. The wind carried a thin metallic scent. Soon, by sundown, he was back at the widow's door. She was waiting with a lamp and a question she did not ask aloud. He told her what he had seen, and her shoulders dropped with a mixture of fear and decision. She had spent months adrift in sorrow, letting the river current pull her where it wished. Now she chose. She pulled out her husband's old rifle and set it on the table. The butt was worn smooth from hands that had farmed more than they had hunted. "I don't want blood," she said, "but I will not be carried off like a stray." He nodded, touched the rifle, and set it aside. "Steel makes a man brave until it sings," he said. "We will try the quiet way first." The quiet way meant watching and waiting, and it meant inviting a friend the town did not know she had. Near midnight, a figure slipped from the windbreak and lifted a hand in greeting. It was a trader who stopped by twice a year, a lean man with a mule and a calm way of moving. Everyone called him Old Smoke, though he was not as old as the name claimed. He brought news, a pouch of salt, and a warning. The troop at the fort had split. A captain with restless eyes saw promotion in every skirmish. A corporal from town had joined him gladly. There were also 2 teens who had never fired a shot outside of a game, and a weathered scout who had seen enough to listen. When the earth spoke, "They ride at dawn," Old Smoke said. "They will not come to talk." The widow thanked him, pressed bread into his hands, and gave him the best thing she owned to send to her sister if the worst came to pass. Old Smoke took the bundle and shook his head. "Keep your gifts," he said. "I will circle wide and send the scout your way if I can. He owes me a favor from before the river dried." The Apache clasped the trader's arm in a way that spoke more than words. When the man vanished, the yard felt strange, as if it had grown larger to hold the shape of all that might happen. The night brought no sleep. The widow sat by the hearth and told the Apache about the life she had planned when she came west. She had wanted a big table, not fancy, just strong, with chairs that scraped the floor when children rushed to sit. She spoke the words carefully, as if they might shatter in her mouth. He listened without pity. When she finished, he unrolled a bundle and showed her seeds saved from his people. Corn that stood taller, beans that clung tight, squash with a heart that kept through winter. "Plant when the geese fly north," he said. "A house breathes again when it feeds the earth." Touched the seeds and felt a tremor in her chest that was not fear. Before dawn, the prairie woke with a small sound, like a wire pulled taut. Horses. The widow stepped to the window and saw silhouettes against the paling sky. 4 riders and a 5th on foot, walking beside a twisting shape she realized was a mule. Old Smoke had kept his word. The one on foot was the scout. He raised a hand, cautious as a man who has learned that haste is what death loves. The Apache went to meet him between house and barn. They spoke in a mixture of tongue and gesture, and the scout measured every word before he let it fly. He had tried to slow the captain. The captain wanted a story to send east, something about a hostel, camp, and a rescued woman. The corporal wanted a notch on his pride. The young ones wanted to prove they were men. "By noon, they will be here," the scout said. "They will claim they came to check your safety. If you open your door, they will search your home. If you refuse, they will call it defiance." The widow stepped forward. "If they touch my husband's grave, I will curse them to the wind." The scout listened and looked at her with the tired respect a man saves for truth. He spoke to the Apache again and shook his head like a man who has seen too many hard roads merging into one. "I will walk slow," he said. "I will be between them and the door as long as I can." He left the mule in his canteen, and for reasons he didn't name, he left a small leather book wrapped in cloth. It held sketches of plants and stars and a pressed wildflower that had kept its color. The widow slid it into her apron without thinking why. The Apache watched the trail long after the scout vanished, then turned to the work of setting boundaries that men with rifles could not see. He drew symbols in ash above the door and tied a strip of red cloth to the lowest branch of the cottonwood. He placed 4 stones at the corners of the yard and whispered to each, calling on those who had walked here before fences. The widow felt foolish and then safe, which is how faith often feels when it first wakes up. In town, the corporal was tightening his saddle when the preacher stepped into the street. The church bell had not rung yet, but the man's voice carried the same weight. "You ride to a widow's home," the preacher said. "Take caution with your hands." The corporal smirked and touched 2 fingers to his hat. "We go to save her," he said. "From what?" the preacher asked. "From loneliness or from your pride?" The street went quiet. The corporal's jaw clicked once. He turned his horse without another word and trotted off to meet the captain at the edge of town. From a window, the preacher's wife watched and prayed the simple prayer of a woman who knows story from gossip. The troop moved out at a steady pace. The captain rode in front, shoulders squared, thinking of letters he might write about duty and order. The 2 boys trailed behind, faces set in looks they had practiced for mirrors. Between them walked the scout, eyes low, scanning the ground. He saw quail scatter and noted the way the wind curled over the grass. Signs said caution. The captain called it nerves. They had little water and less patience. Back at the farm, the widow packed a small bag against the Apache's advice, not for flight, but for dignity. If they dragged her from her home, she would carry what little of her life she could hold. She tucked the seeds into the bag and the leather book beside them. The Apache watched without judgment and tightened the lashings on the barn door. "They will come with noise," he said, "and they will expect fear." He showed her a path cut through the sunflowers that ran toward a low ravine. "If I signal, take this path and do not look back. A place waits for you beyond the bend." She nodded, then refused the thought. "I will not leave you," she said. "Not unless the sky itself gives the order." The sunlight rose, and with it the shape of three strangers at the edge of the field. Not soldiers, neighbors. A thin farmer with a mouth like a knife. A storekeeper who smiled until someone needed kindness. A girl from the laundry with a red scarf tied at her throat. They stood on the fence rail and watched, making no attempt to hide. The widow felt shame flush her skin, then grow hot enough to burn. The Apache ignored them, but he moved with a stillness that told her he had counted them and judged their hunger. People crave stories more than bread. The easiest story to swallow is the one where another person is wrong. By late morning, the troop was close enough for dust to taste. The scout lifted a hand and slowed his pace, forcing the captain to check his horse. The captain glared and pointed forward. The scout nodded and kept walking, counting steps like a man measuring a fuse. Behind them, the two boys talked too loud about glory. One mentioned the corporal's promise that there would be reward money if the Apache was caught. The other pretended not to like the sound of that, and liked it anyway. The first sight of the homestead hit the boys with surprise. They had expected a shack, a hiding place at best. Instead, they saw a clean yard, a white cloth on a line, a small fire burning blue. The captain sat straighter, as if the neatness itself insulted him. He was a man who could forgive mess because it looked like need, but order looked like defiance. The scout stepped ahead and called out, "We come to speak with the woman," he said. "We come under daylight." The widow stood in the doorway with the Apache a step behind her shoulder. She held nothing in her hands. The captain saw the empty hands and felt cheated of the danger he'd rehearsed. He removed his hat and spoke with the voice he used when the colonel visited. "Ma'am, we have reports you are under duress." She met his eyes without blinking. "I am under the sky," she said. "Like you." The captain offered to search the house. The scout looked at the Apache and saw that he knew the shape of this dance. The neighbors leaned on the fence, hungry for a first move. The wind stilled in a way that made small sounds large. The Apache stepped forward and said, "You may speak on the porch." The captain smiled with teeth. "You are on the wrong side of the law." A crow lifted from the cottonwood. The red cloth tied to the branch snapped once, a quick flag. The Apache's gaze flicked to the ravine path without moving his head. The widow set her feet. The scout took a breath that tasted of iron and regret. The corporal shifted his rifle and smiled, like a boy who has picked a fight and only now remembers it can hurt. No. One saw old smoke appear on the far hill except the scout. The trader stood beside his mule, small as a prayer against the distance, and raised a mirror to catch the sun. A flash moved across the field like a sharp thought. The scout did not know if the signal meant help or warning. It meant only this: the moment had arrived, and it would judge them all. The captain put his boot on the first step of the porch and said he would enter. Apache lifted his palm and said he would not. The neighbors breathed in together, as if air could sharpen their vision. The widow's heart beat time with the flutter of the red cloth. Somewhere under the floorboards, a mouse halted and listened. The earth itself seemed to turn its head. Between one word and the next, the scout made his choice. He stepped forward, placing his body in the space where the captain's will and the Apache's promise were about to collide. He lifted his hands, palms out, to say wait. He opened his mouth to speak the sentence that might hold a door closed or open it without breaking the frame. He never got the sentence out. Far off from the ridge behind the house came the hard crack of a single rifle, then the falling echo of a second. Every bird in the field took flight at once. The captain turned toward the sound with triumph already forming on his face. The corporal grinned and raised his weapon. The widow did not blink. The Apache did not move. The scout felt the shape of the leather book missing from his coat and thought, in a flash, of the pressed flower inside it. The wind started again, pushing the dust in a ribbon between porch and yard. It carried the smell of powder, and under that, an older scent, like rain waiting in stone. The red cloth lifted and pointed toward the ravine, then dropped, then lifted again. The path lay ready. The door was still open. The law was still hungry. The land had decided nothing yet. The echo of the gunfire hung over the valley like thunder trapped between the clouds and the earth. The horses reared, the captain barked an order, and the widow stood frozen in the doorway, her breath caught between prayer and defiance. The Apache did not move. His hand rested against the post, steady as a mountain, but his eyes dark and sharp had already measured every angle, every soul standing before him. The scout knew the moment had turned. What had been a standoff was now a spark. The captain spun toward the ridge, waving for his men to spread out. "They fired from the tree line," he shouted. "Find them?" The corporal cocked his rifle. The two young soldiers scrambled, eager to prove courage they hadn't yet earned. Dust rose as they dashed toward the north field, trampling the wildflowers that had dared to bloom through the dry season. The widow's heart pounded as she stepped beside the Apache.
"Who fired?"
she whispered. He didn't answer. His jaw tightened as he looked beyond the horizon. Somewhere in that distance, someone had made their move, perhaps old Smoke, perhaps another watching shadow. Whoever it was, it meant the world had chosen sides and the time for peace was slipping away. The scout lifted his hand, trying to calm the captain. "We don't know who fired. Could have been a hunter or a boy with nerves." But the captain's face had hardened into something beyond reason. "Don't tell me how to do my duty," he snapped. "We'll end this today." He turned toward the house, eyes sharp on the Apache. "Step aside," he ordered. "You're harboring a fugitive." The Apache's voice was low even. "There are no fugitives here, only people who wish to live." "Then why hide?" the captain said, climbing the porch steps, his boots heavy on the wood. "Why stand guard over a woman that ain't yours?" The words cut through the air. The widow's breath hitched. She wanted to shout, to remind the captain that she owed no man her allegiance, but her throat burned with fear and pride. The Apache simply watched, his silence more dangerous than any weapon. The scout saw what was coming. He reached for the captain's arm, but it was too late. The captain shoved past and stepped into the threshold. In that heartbeat, the air itself seemed to tighten. The Apache blocked his path. Their eyes met, and the world narrowed to the width of the doorway. "Back away," the captain warned. "That's an order." "This is her home," the Apache said quietly. "Not yours." For a moment, no one breathed. The sound of horses, the clatter of rifles, even the wind seemed to fade. Then, far off, another shot cracked, this one closer, sharper, deliberate. A puff of dirt leaped near the corporal's boots. The young soldiers froze, eyes wide. The captain spun again, cursing. Ambush. He shouted, ducking for cover. The scout fell to one knee, scanning the ridge. "No, it's a warning," he said. "They're not aiming to kill." But fear had already taken the captain. He fired a wild shot into the air, shouting for his men to return fire. Chaos erupted, horses bolted, bullets split branches, and smoke curled through the field. The widow covered her ears, crouching low as splinters rained from the porch beams. The Apache moved fast, pulling her toward the hearth, away from the open door. "Stay down," he told her, his voice calm amid the storm. He took up her husband's old rifle and crouched beside the window, eyes scanning the ridge. He didn't fire. He was waiting, listening. The scout crawled toward the porch, shouting over the noise. "Captain, stop. You're firing blind." But the captain's rage was louder than reason. "Blind or not, I'll burn them out." Inside the cabin, the widow trembled. "They'll kill us," she whispered. The Apache looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Only if we let them." He handed her a small leather pouch when she had seen him carry but never open. "If I fall, take this and go to the ravine. There's a trail behind the rocks. It leads to the river bend. Old Smoke will find you." She gripped the pouch, shaking her head. "You said we'd have life here. You said the land would rise again." He met her eyes, and something fierce passed between them. "It will," he said. "But sometimes the land bleeds first." Outside, the scout was shouting again, trying to regain control. The two young soldiers had taken cover behind the fence, firing at shadows they couldn't see. The corporal knelt by the barn, scanning the field. He caught sight of a figure-old Smoke, distant on the ridge, holding a mirror to the sun. The flash blinded him for a second, and when his vision cleared, the man was gone. The captain ordered them forward. Circle the house. Flush him out. The scout hesitated. "Sir, there's a woman inside." "Then she answer for her choices," the captain growled. The corporal and one of the boys ran toward the barn, crouched low. The other soldier stayed behind, trembling, his hands slick on his rifle. He had never heard bullets fly before that day, and he prayed to a god who seemed far away. The Apache slipped out the back door, silent as the wind. The widow wanted to follow, but he motioned for her to stay. She pressed against the wall, her heart beating so loud she was sure it would give her away. She watched from the window as he moved through the tall grass, using the light and shadow like a cloak. The scout spotted him and cursed under his breath. "Don't shoot!" he yelled, but the captain's finger was already on the trigger. The shot missed, whistling through the air. The Apache didn't flinch, turned and fired once not to kill, but to shatter the captain's hat where it sat on his head. The shot was a message. Captain staggered back, stunned, his pride wounded deeper than his flesh. "You think this is a game?" he shouted. "We'll hang for that." He waved the corporal forward. "Take the woman. If he wants to play hero, make him watch." The scout's stomach turned cold. "You'll start a war," he said. "It already started," the captain barked. The corporal and the young soldier moved toward the house, stepping over the broken fence. The widow could see their shadows moving closer, their rifles glinting in the sun. She looked at the red cloth still tied to the cottonwood. She'd fluttered once, twice, like a heartbeat. Then the wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. The Apache moved fast, circling behind the barn. The scout saw him and understood. He shouted to the soldiers, "Hold your fire." But the captain, deaf to reason, raised his pistol again. The next moment's blurred shouts, thunder, dust. The corporal reached the porch, his boot hitting the step where blood had once fallen years ago. When the widow's husband had cut his hand mending that same rail, the wood remembered. So did she. She reached for the rifle beside the hearth. Her hand shook, but she steadied her breath. The world had taken everything she loved, and now it wanted what was left. She stood, the weight of the weapon grounding her. When the corporal's shadow filled the doorway, she spoke not in fear, but in fire. "This is my home," she said. The soldier hesitated. The words were not loud, but they carried a truth that made his aim falter. Then the scout shouted from outside, "Captain, behind you." The Apache came out from the tall grass, rifle raised, his eyes fixed on the captain. For a moment, neither man moved. The sun broke through the clouds, lighting the space between them like a stage set for judgment. The captain's finger tightened. Scout lunged forward. The corporal turned toward the noise. The widow gripped the rifle tighter. 4 hearts beat the same second. The world hung on the breath between decision and fate. And then the thunder came again. Closer, sharper, alive with purpose. The wind roared through the valley, carrying the cry of distant riders. Somewhere beyond the ridge, more men were coming, though no one could yet tell if they rode for vengeance, for mercy, or for something older than both. The Apache stepped closer to the captain, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You came to take life," he said quietly. "Now watch how it refuses to die." The captain's face twisted with rage, and he lifted his weapon. The scout reached for him, shouting, "Don't!" But the sound of gunfire drowned every word. When the smoke cleared, the house still stood, half hidden by dust and sunlight. The widow clutched the rifle to her chest, staring toward the doorway, her breath shallow and trembling. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and rain, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would fall first. And in that charged silence, the storm truly began. The shot tore through the air like a scream that wouldn't end. The sound rolled across the plains and disappeared into the hills, leaving behind a silence too heavy to bear. The widow blinked through the haze, smoke curling in thin ribbons across the porch. The captain staggered backward, clutching his arm, the pistol falling from his hand. He looked more shocked than wounded, as if the world itself had betrayed him.
Apaches.
The Apache stood a few yards away, his rifle lowered, his face carved with calm. The scout moved first, rushing forward to take the weapon from the captain's reach. "It's over," he said. But everyone knew it wasn't. The young soldier near the fence dropped his rifle and backed away. The corporal, pale and shaking, turned toward his leader. "Captain," he started, but the word caught in his throat. The captain's eyes burned with something that had nothing to do with pain. "No," he hissed, blood dripping between his fingers. "It's not over until I say." He lunged toward his gun, but the scout held him back. "You'll die for nothing," the scout warned. The captain shoved him away, his voice raw. "You think I care about dying? You think I'll be remembered if I leave now?" The widow stepped out onto the porch, the rifle still in her hands. Her black dress moved in the wind, torn at the hem, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She looked at the man bleeding on her land, then at the others' young faces, frightened, lost in a fight they never understood. "You came here to save me," she said quietly. "But I was never the one who needed saving." The corporal lowered his rifle. "Ma'am, she cut him off. You came because someone told you to be afraid. You came because someone said this man doesn't belong. But neither do I. None of us do. The land was never ours to own. We just keep borrowing it, hoping it forgives us." The wind rose again, stirring the dust. The Apache stood beside her, silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the smoke from the ridge was beginning to fade. Old Smoke appeared there a moment later, leading his mule down the slope. He carried no weapon, only the weight of truth written across his face. The scout helped the captain to his feet. "We'll take you back to town," he said, but the captain shook his head. "They'll call me weak," he muttered. "They'll say I ran." The scout's voice softened. "Let them. You'll live, and that's something they'll never understand." The captain looked from the scout to the Apache, and something in his eyes shifted. Maybe it was the pain, maybe the quiet dignity standing before him, but his anger began to unravel. He stumbled toward his horse, clutching his wounded arm, and climbed into the saddle with the help of the corporal. "Go," he told his men. "We're done here." The soldiers obeyed, eager to leave the cursed field behind. They rode away slowly, glancing back once or twice, their faces pale under the sun. The scout lingered last, standing at the edge of the yard. "I'll tell them you weren't here," he said to the Apache. "And I'll tell them this woman's land is empty." The Apache nodded once. Sometimes lies keep the peace better than truth. The scout gave a faint smile. Sometimes he agreed. Then he turned and followed the others down the long road back to the fort. When they were gone, the world grew still again. The wind moved softly through the tall grass, carrying the smell of rain and smoke. The widow set the rifle aside, her hands trembling from exhaustion. She looked at the Apache and tried to speak, but no words came. The tears she had held back for so long finally broke free. He stepped closer and caught her before she fell, holding her like something precious that had survived the fire. For a while neither said a word. Land itself seemed to breathe again. Red cloth tied to the cottonwood fluttered weakly, half burnt, half live. A sign, maybe, that not all things must die to begin again. Days passed before the fields grew quiet enough to feel like home. The soldiers never returned. The preacher came once, standing at the fence, hat in hand. He said the town was uneasy, that folks were whispering, but none dared come near. "I think you're cursed," he said gently, "or blessed. I suppose it depends on who's telling it." The widow smiled faintly. "Let them talk. I've been both before." He looked past her at the man standing in the yard, fixing the broken gate with patient hands. "You'll never have peace here," the preacher warned. She met his eyes. "Peace isn't what I came for," she said. "I came for life." The preacher nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he wanted to admit. He tipped his hat and left, his figure fading into the wide horizon. The seasons turned. Crops began to rise again, green against the gold of the plains. The Apache taught her how to listen to the land to plant by the moon, to read the shape of clouds for rain, to thank the soil for every seed it kept. She taught him words from her books, how to write the sound of his own name, how to fix a fence with nothing but wire and will. Their lives were stitched together from silence and small things, shared work, quiet meals, long nights by the fire. In spring, she found herself standing by the well one morning, her hands resting on her stomach. The same emptiness that had haunted her for years now felt different, alive, waiting. She didn't speak of it right away. She let the feeling grow in secret, like the seeds buried under the frost. When she finally told him, his face broke into something rare, a smile that reached his eyes. The land kept its promise, he said. She laughed softly, tears running down her cheeks. You said we'd have 5, she reminded him, placed his hand over hers. Then we will. The months that followed were not easy. But the town still kept its distance, and riders sometimes passed along the far road, watching but never stopping. The widow grew heavier with each moon, her steps slower, her eyes softer. The Apache built a cradle from cedar and sinew, humming low songs while he worked. Old Smoke came often, bringing herbs and news. He told them the fort had moved farther west. The captain had resigned his post, and the scout had vanished into the hills. When the child came, the world was quiet. Rain tapped softly on the roof, and the fire burned low. She held the newborn in her arms, his skin warm and his breath steady. The Apache knelt beside her, touching the baby's cheek with reverence. He'll carry both worlds, he said. And maybe one day he'll make them stop fighting. Years slipped by like watered-down stone. The house stood stronger than before, the land richer. The widow grew older, her hair touched with silver. The Apache's strength never left him, but the lines on his face deepened, carved by sun and memory. Their son grew wild and curious, chasing lizards, climbing fences, asking questions about everything. He listened to both his parents' stories, the hymns of her church, and the songs of his father's people. In him, the two worlds met without breaking. Sometimes at dusk, the widow would stand by the cottonwood, where the red cloth still hung, now faded to brown. She'd watch the horizon and remember that day when the land almost turned to ash. She'd think of the soldiers, of the scout's weary kindness, of the preacher's warning. And she'd whisper a quiet thanks not for what had been taken, but for what had stayed. One summer evening, as the sun melted into the tall grass, the Apache came to her side. He looked out across the fields where their son was running, laughing, chasing fireflies. He'll leave one day, the Apache said. He'll follow the rivers, like all who are meant to carry stories. She nodded. Then he'll know how to find his way back. They stood together as the sky burned red and gold, the world around them alive with the hum of crickets and the whisper of wind. The land that had once divided them now bound them in its quiet grace. The widow leaned her head against his shoulder. You think they'll ever stop hating what they don't understand? She asked. He thought for a long time, before answering. Maybe not, he said. But if they listen, they might start to understand what they hate. She smiled, her eyes glistening in the fading light. Then we'll keep teaching them, she said softly. The last light of day settled over the plains, golden and endless. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled not in anger, but in memory. The earth was breathing again, steady and alive. The barren widow who once prayed for life had found it, not in promises of heaven, but in the quiet heart of the land and the man who taught her how to hear it. And when the night finally came, it came gently, carrying the sound of laughter across the field, the laughter of a child who would never know the fences that once kept his parents apart. The stars above seemed closer, brighter, as if the sky itself had bent to listen. And in that vast stillness, the story of the widow and the Apache became part of the land's own song, a story, not of loss, but of what can grow even from the ashes.